Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is the 21st of September 2012, and this is the weekly Hack Education podcast with Audrey Waters. Hi, Audrey.
Hello, hello.
If there was any week where you would have to tell me there's a hard stop, this is not the week I'd want it to be. So I actually want to take these out of order, your posts, because I think there's such interesting discussions around the fear of missing out and the EdTech reporting sucks that I'd like to actually start with those. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
So FOMO, the fear of missing out. You've used a name. I looked it up and I realized it's not unique to you, but interestingly, you've named an affliction that I have felt but didn't know was actually named. And
I think it's something, it's something that I've been tracking on for a while now, and I think that certainly this isn't a term that I've invented. Lots of people have been talking about it. I think perhaps Sherry Turkle most famously sort of alludes to it in her latest book, Alone Together, as being this feeling that we have, particularly with the rise of social media and mobile devices and the sort of pressure for 24/7 connectivity, that if we step away from our smartphones, if we step away from the computer, if we don't pay attention to Twitter, if we don't log into Facebook, we might be missing something. I think it feels like this sort of compulsion to participate, not even being certain that there's a thing that you're participating in. It's just this sort of fear of missing out.
But it's this connection with MOOCs and universities that's just such a compelling thought. And we've talked about it. We've sort of talked around it, talked directly about it. But with universities, it's not about the connectivity as much as it appears to be kind of a moment of desperation. Does it have that feel to you?
Well, this is what's so interesting to me. This is my response to Coursera, which is the online education startup that sort of grew out of Stanford. This is my response to the news this week that 17 more schools have joined Coursera, have partnered on its platform. And what really struck me was that, especially reading the New York Times story, was that several of the administration members who were quoted didn't say, "Oh, we're doing this to sort of bring a world-class education to the rest of the world. We care very much about making sure that everybody has access to higher ed." It was all couched in terms of everyone else is doing this, the Ivy League is doing this, and we're afraid if we don't do it, we might look bad.
If we're wrong about our perception of this MOOC movement, we're not even a footnote, right? I mean, you and I are voices, out in the forest that have fallen and nobody heard them. But if we're right, I don't think anybody's going to give us a lot of credit here. I was fascinated by the quote from Mr. G, who said he had some concerns about giving away content with no revenue stream in sight. He says, "That does keep me up at night."
Right. Yeah.
Because we're doing. Go ahead.
Yeah. And yet, sort of onward they go.
Here's the rest of this quote. "We're doing this in the hope and expectation that we'll be able to build a financial model, but I don't know what it is. But we can't be too far behind in an area that's growing and changing as fast as this one." This is just a fascinating moment to be kind of watching how this takes place. Now, the counter argument would be, these are really smart people, right? And these first iterations are not what's going to happen. And isn't it likely that you get institutions of this size, both in terms of their influence and people within them being creative, that they will figure out some good things?
I think that that's certainly the possibility. And I would want to say here, too, is that in many of these cases, this is not the only online effort that these universities have made. Some have dabbled in this before. Of course, I had to chuckle that among the list of universities that joined Coursera this week was Columbia University, which of course had a similar and rather disastrous effort several years ago with a project called Fathom to do this sort of online, open online education. But I do think that these other universities have other, they offer other classes online, but there's something particularly compelling right now at this moment about the MOOC, or certainly the variation of MOOC that we're seeing coming out of Coursera that has universities really in a panic. And perhaps it is that they want to make sure that when innovations happen, that they're there to take advantage of it. But to me, it feels very much like a marketing move to make the universities seem as though they're really on the leading edge of something that might just be the next big thing.
Wow. Okay. This is the one that could easily consume a couple of hours for me, but it's the pain test post about the Ed Startup 101.
Yeah.
And you identify a phrase, right, EdTech reporting sucks, as the pain test, but then you also sort of candidly admit that that's not really a pain point for most people.
No, I mean, and I think that this is, the exercise of writing out these things for this Ed Startup 101 class has been really interesting for me. I mean, it's one of those examples where it's a good reminder that Hack Education is very much it is my personal blog. It is a place where I work out my own ideas, and I do a lot of sort of reflective and reflexive writing there that isn't necessarily, not necessarily EdTech reporting. But I do think about this a lot. I mean, I feel like Hack Education, I want it to be a site that I would want to read. I want to be able to offer, smart analysis and insight and think deeply about what I think is a very important subject. But I don't know if there's sort of this huge unserved market of people who shake their fist at some of the other technology and education publications that are out there right now.
I want to argue against the whole idea that the pain point needs to be a monetizable pain point. So tell me if I'm going the right direction for you.
No, I think, and I would actually even take it one step farther back, which is thinking about, and actually Stephen Downes responded to this piece on his site today saying, do we even need to be thinking about sort of pain in this way? I mean, after all, many innovations are things that people didn't realize that they wanted, right? And you didn't realize until the iPod came along that you needed a digital portable music device. You didn't realize until the iPhone came along that this was something that was, that you were lacking. And so if you just think about things in terms of pain and then entrepreneurialism sort of addressing pain, it's not necessarily innovative, or it's not necessarily sort of, it's a very sort of almost defensive, certainly sort of Band-Aid, in a lot of ways sort of Band-Aid solutions. It doesn't actually get to the roots of, to the root of the problem, and it doesn't necessarily sort of move the conversation to the side and then sort of go around sort of what would be typically seen as sort of challenges and obstacles and frustrations. And I fully agree with you about this question of this question of monetizing around pain is, that's something we're supposed to address in next week. But I think, I spend a lot of time thinking about it because I look at other technology and education technology publications, particularly ones that are that have optimized what they do for money, and that's definitely I think that that's part of the problem that we're at right now is the way in which the monetization tends to dictate the solution.
I want to make two arguments against it. Yeah, solutions. I want to make two arguments against it. One of which is, if you look at something like the civil rights movement, right, that's true sort of human pain that often has nothing to do with the financial. And I mean, you don't need to look for a revenue source to say, okay, the change needs to happen. And so the pain for me wouldn't be that ed tech reporting sucks. The pain is that there is a disenfranchisement of true value for people because of corporate interests. Yeah. So my first sort of pushback is, okay, so the pain is real, but it's not a pain, this idea of monetizing it, like you said, as an entrepreneurial opportunity doesn't make any sense if the pain is a real human pain. The second is our food analogy. Okay, so bear with me for a second here. So we went to a Thai restaurant the other night. It was this lovely little tiny Thai place. And I thought, this is really interesting. There's a commitment to a certain kind of food. They start cooking it. They build up a clientele and customers. And then they're in a relationship with those customers based on doing something that they love and are providing for them, which is very different than sort of like a national chain of food stores that go in and might identify pain as a way of almost sort of manipulating community response and using sort of marketing strategy to get people to come in and spend money, which is so far removed from the act of cooking what you love to an act of looking for financial return. That it was sort of my first response was, okay, to use this pain test, which is not it's not the first time we've heard this, right, from a Tech Startup 101. Khalid Smith has used the same phrase. But is the pain test taking you in a direction away from authentic value and service to thinking about business in terms of revenue, which leads you in a completely different direction?
No, and I think that's precise. I think that sort of precisely gets to some of the struggles that I have, sort of deep, sort of philosophical struggles about whether what I do in hack education, if I can even sort of school it into this model that others are using to sort of think about creating an education startup. Even though, you and I have talked before that there are certainly entrepreneurial aspects of what I do. Certainly that I am, self-employed. This is hack education is part of the way in which, I pay my bills. And yet answering these sorts of questions to me doesn't seem to move things forward in a way that I'm necessarily comfortable with them going. And I don't feel that it's actually it feels as though it's sort of the wrong questions. And so once you start answering the wrong questions, you're certainly solving a different set of problems.
Well, it's intriguing because if the pain test is sort of a common way of looking at the educational technology market, obviously brought from other entrepreneurial markets, then it carries with it this value set that's more like the chain restaurant than it is like the small, authentic cuisine restaurant. I want to present a situation to you and ask you, if the tables were turned, I'm hoping this will give you a chance to think about your situation. So last night I interviewed Bob Glinner, who's a filmmaker who made a movie called Schools That Change Communities, about place-based education. And it's brilliant. Really fascinating look at a different way of sort of building curriculum in a school. I had 3 people show up for the show. By the end of the show, there were maybe 6 or 7. But the day before, I'd done one on 21st century skills, and over 60 people showed up. And I felt terrible for Bob that I had got him out he had to actually went to a university in order to be able to do the thing, and to have such a terribly small audience. But to me, it felt almost as though the more significant topic draws the lesser audience. And if I were to apply the pain test, I wouldn't be doing the interviews that I think are the most significant.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that this is, I think think of the sort of the way in which, particularly around, journalism, but certainly, education technology journalism, the things that probably get the most page views, the things that most people click on, the stories that are likely to appear sort of retweeted on Twitter and posted to multiple Facebook pages and shared around the office, so to speak, are not necessarily the ones that are, I think, the most important. They tend to be, what you just said, the sort of 21st century skill. Here's a list of 10, the 10 21st century skill types of things. Here's that sort of. There's a certain superficiality, I think, that it comes back to the fear of missing out too, that we seem to be cultivating with a lot of our social media and sharing practices.
So if you were to rewrite the Ed Startup 101 curriculum for week 4, what question would you ask instead of the pain test question? I think that part of the problem with thinking about it, framing it in terms of pain, is that it is in terms of fixing a broken thing. I think of this in sort of medical terms, right? You broke a bone, we're going to fix it. You skinned your knee, we're going to put a Band-Aid on it. You have a fever, take an aspirin, and it doesn't seem to sort of get, as I said earlier, it doesn't seem to sort of get to some of the underlying sort of systemic things that you might not see if you're sort of just looking at it in terms of what you can easily identify as the pain that you can cure. Brilliant.
So I think that we need to, and I think that we do need to have a different sort of diagnostic tools as we talk about what's wrong, because I don't think that sort of broken systems or sort of this way in which we can just sort of glance over things. I think that obsession with looking at test scores is a great example of this. I think that we're sort of identifying, if you just look at test scores as the problem, then the solution is sort of more test prep, more time spent studying for the teaching around and studying for the test. And that's, I think you're solving that pain, right? But it's actually the wrong thing altogether.
I think you've done a brilliant job bringing in another analogy, right? So the food one works really well here. I think also medicine works well, right? So there are symptoms and there are causes. So so often, pharmaceutical companies, so sort of a large money is around treating symptoms rather than helping educate on the causes. So there is this sort of interesting pushback here, right, that educational companies that don't have a component of helping to educate the users, then end up being a financial company. So to what degree is it legitimate to say, okay, if you're an educational company, part of your mission ought to and should be educating about what you're doing, knowing that the moment you say that, people will say, well, you're not going to get funding for that.
Well, this is so interesting. This is actually something I didn't write about this week. I ended up tweeting about it, was that there is a certain test prep startup that seems to consistently get stories written about it, even though there's really nothing interesting about it. It's really sort of the old sort of Princeton Review or Kaplan Review book that you would get to study for your SAT exam, but now it's on the iPad. And so the multiple choice tests, instead of you filling them out with a pencil as you practice your vocabulary, now you touch the screen on your iPad. But they have a great PR team, and every time they release a new app or that there's some modicum of difference, all of the technology companies write about them. And I tweeted saying, like, why are you covering this story? Like, it's not interesting. It's not interesting technology. It's not interesting content, for crying out loud. It's test prep. But I think that it certainly fits into the that company would fit very neatly into the pain test model. And so I think that we get, I think that when we're thinking about things in that way, we really then can't have a more nuanced conversation, or a conversation that gets to the heart of some of these issues around. I mean, and you could say too that testing industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's a monetizable pain. Go for it. It's a great idea for a startup, and yet it's a terrible idea if you want to get to these root causes, I think, that are really underlying the problems that we identify with the way in which teaching and learning and schooling and systems happen.
I think this is a moment of clarity. In the same way that your Audrey test post, sort of brought clarity to a moment, I think this pain test post is a moment of clarity. That this is really the driving kind of mindset behind a lot of the ed tech startups. It's the Silicon Valley venture capital. How are we going to succeed financially? And I think this conversation clarifies the downside to that mentality.
Yep.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good for you.
Yeah, because I think, especially I think, next week when we're supposed to layer on top of this question of monetization, I think it becomes skewed even more. I mean, it's one thing to say, I think it's one thing to sort of identify pain in your life, and that move towards addressing that. Sort of taking that out of the business prospect. But once you do add in the money in the markets, I think that it goes even further off, or the potential for it going further off track is certainly greater.
Okay, let's switch to some really positive news. I love the Google Summer of Code post.
Yes. I love, this is a great project that Google does. I think they've run this for, 8 years now. Every summer, they, college students from all over the world can participate in this sort of virtual internships where they have an opportunity to work on real-world computer software development projects, and they're open source software development projects. So there's sort of the benefits are multiple. I mean, many of the organizations that they work for, some of them are big name companies, like organizations like Wikipedia or Creative Commons. Most of them are actually pretty tiny development shops, and so they benefit by having students that they get to work with. I think students benefit by getting to work in the open source community and to have a strong mentoring relationship, and get to see sort of what it's like to be an engineer in the real world. So I had a great conversation with a young man from the University of Chicago who sort of explained his rationale for why he chose the project he did, what he worked on, and interestingly enough, and again, a win if you're thinking about how to get more people interested in computer science. Sort of made the decision that he wanted to be a computer science major now, and not a math major. I think this real world experience was really powerful for him.
It also sort of intriguingly shines a light on this disconnect between the story of employability and education, right? Because I think he mentioned the fact that he would never, really didn't have the chance to do this inside his traditional schooling environment, right? And if you really wanted a kid to be able to get a job from high school, you would teach them the LAMP stack, right? I mean, you would teach them the basics of internet, right? So there is this sort of huge disconnect between what someone coming out of high school gets and what would actually make them employable, and that's a fascinating. Well,
I would even say what you'd get even in a traditional computer science degree oftentimes. I thought it was really interesting. I mean, this was someone who's, clearly has sort of a strong background in math and had been doing some app development on his own. But it was interesting that he said that, he actually ended up building some iOS apps for CERN in Switzerland. And it was interesting that that was a skill that he had learned on his own, and so it wasn't something that he had in any sort of formal curriculum as well. And so again, I think it's this great example of how when we formalize curriculum and we fixate so much on what students should learn in the classroom that we forget that the world is changing quite rapidly. And although I would agree with you that the LAMP stack is still pretty core. I mean, I think that spending time learning a specific computer language isn't necessarily the right thing. I mean, when things are changing so quickly.
Really interesting. Well, kudos to Google, but a great program. So what does open mean?
Yeah, open is an adjective now that appears on so many things that I think we're really at risk of losing a lot of meaning. I see consulting firms, investment firms talk about being open education. I see people. I see things. I mean, I think the Coursera MOOCs are a great example where they have, MOOC has open as one of the words in the acronym there, and we need to push back some. We need to push back and ask really what we mean by that. I think the other danger though is to become so obsessed with the politics around it that you get into a situation that I think that Creative Commons is in now, with adding these other layers of judgment when a particular license doesn't fit.
Right. So yeah, there's sort of both sides there. You make a note about the fact that it pops up this little asterisk, not little, large asterisk. This is not a free culture.
Yeah, huge.
As if people weren't already confused enough. Now they got to learn what a free culture license is, and they're guilty.
I mean, and I think that this is a real tension around this issue of open, particularly when it comes to licensing. This research that I'm doing around open educational resources, there's so much confusion about what it means, what we mean, what these licenses mean, the variety of Creative Commons licenses, and I would say too confusion about what copyright means, what you can use in terms of fair use. But I think that it's even more confusing when something like this new generator that Creative Commons has just implemented is supposed to make it easier for you to identify which license you'd want to use on your work, then comes with this message that is sort of out of nowhere. And if you aren't familiar with these debates, which I'm guessing most people who use this generator probably aren't, it certainly adds this other layer of confusion that it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people just walk away and say, well, at least I have a better sense of what the Circle C for copyright means. So I'll go with that.
Well, the juxtaposition of the iPhone 5 coming out and the incredible popularity of what's really a closed system, right, is a reminder that we will often choose simple over complex. And sometimes simple actually delivers better for us, even if it's closed, than complex does. Yep. Well, and then
and I think that.
Go ahead.
I think that's something that we really struggle with when it comes to sort of debates within, whether it's debates within open source or debates within OER, debates within open education about these terms. I think sometimes it's easy to get so immersed in this free culture debate around Creative Commons is an interesting example that I don't think that these debates make sense for a lot of folks, and I think that if sort of the paradox that the choice of the multitude of choices of openness that are supposed to sort of benefit the creator and benefit the user, that all of those choices make it actually more difficult, more complicated, and I think people then actually, if it doesn't actually feel like the freedom to choose your license, it feels like something like a burden.
Well, and then you add aggregating different content with different open licenses, and almost the inability to do so because you can't match the licenses up. Is this just a case of the more thoughtful solution is more complex and more nuanced, and so by virtue of that you just accept that it will it exists as a secondary model that in many ways is healthier but requires more thinking?
I think that to me that is the answer, and to me the answer here, rather than sort of codify exactly what we mean by open in every circumstance and have some sort of generator where we can say, okay, oh, that's open, that's closed. If you have 4 out of 5 answers to these questions are open, then you're open. But I think that we have to recognize that there is a lot of nuance and debate around this, and we have to. I think that it's not the easy solution, but it certainly feels like a better one to me.
Yeah, I wonder how we'll feel in 5 years. I wonder if this will simplify in some ways, or maybe it's just that we know what closed is. The rest is just different varieties. Mm-hmm. And you'd say, the trying to put everything into the word open is not going to work. But let's also be willing to call people on it when they say something is open and it really doesn't have aspects of openness to it.
Right. I think it is going to be really interesting to watch, particularly with more and more government agencies, so federal, state, local level, being interested in open education resources. I do wonder if some of the confusion around the different licenses will be resolved, or how much some of these will be barriers to more adoption and to more reuse.